The ancient beams groaned like living things beneath the weight of centuries. Marcus Keller, the lead restoration architect, had warned the Prague municipality that the old new synagogue's timber roof couldn't hold much longer. The wood, he'd said during the preliminary survey, was compromised, punctured by woodworms, warped by countless freeze-thaw cycles, and bearing loads it was never engineered to sustain. Still, nobody had expected the collapse to happen on a Tuesday morning in October, while only 3 workers occupied the scaffolding below. The sound was apocalyptic. A thunderous crack echoed through the narrow street, followed by the splintering shriek of wood surrendering to gravity. Dust billowed from the eastern nave like smoke from a bomb site. When it settled, the morning light poured through the roof cavity in geometric shafts, revealing what had been sealed above the plaster ceiling for more than 300 years. Marcus was examining the fallen timbers when David, one of the restoration crew, called him over. The younger man stood frozen before a wooden strongbox. Its iron bands corroded nearly to powder, its lid split open by the impact. Inside, wrapped in cloth so fragile it resembled ash, lay 7 scrolls. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the dark staining on the parchment. Ancient, dried, unmistakably the color of blood. The municipality called the police. The police called the university. The university called specialists from Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. By noon, the synagogue had become a controlled crime scene, though no one could quite explain what crime, if any, had occurred. The scrolls themselves were Torah, complete and written in a hand so precise, it suggested they were copied by a master scribe. But the dried blood transformed them from mere religious artifacts into historical enigmas. Rabbi Yochanan Stein, 83 years old, and the spiritual custodian of the Prague Jewish community, arrived at the scene before the university team. He stood before the strongbox, with tears streaming down his face, whispering prayers no one else could hear. When he finally looked up, he turned to Marcus with an intensity that made the architect step back. "These weren't hidden by accident," the rabbi said quietly. "Someone put them there to survive." Marcus felt the weight of that statement settle over the synagogue like dust. The restoration project, which had seemed like a straightforward exercise in structural preservation, had just become something far more complicated. The roof collapse had torn open not just the building's skin, but a question buried in the structure itself. Who had hidden these scrolls, and why had they been marked with blood? The October afternoon grew cold. As workers photographed and catalogued the strongbox and its contents, Marcus found himself staring at the hole in the roof, the sudden aperture through which history was bleeding back into the present. Somewhere in the archives of Prague, he suspected, there was a story waiting to be unearthed. A story written in blood and parchment, hidden by hands now centuries dust, but speaking still to anyone willing to listen. Chapter 2. The Blood and the Questions, Dr. Elena Moravec arrived from the Charles University Library with her team of conservators and forensic experts. She was 60, meticulous, and carried herself with the manner of someone who had spent 30 years learning to read the silences that objects kept. Her first act was to carefully extract a single thread from the cloth, wrapping one of the scrolls, and submit it for analysis. Her second was to examine the bloodstains under magnification. "Medieval," she announced, after nearly 2 hours of preliminary study, or close to it. The oxidation pattern, the crystallization of the hemoglobin residue, I'd estimate between 1620 and 1660, possibly earlier. Marcus was present for the analysis, having been retained as a consultant for the restoration team's investigation. Elena's precision unsettled him. She spoke about blood as if it were simply another text to be deciphered, which he supposed it was. "But here's what troubles me," Elena continued, turning from her microscope. "The staining is deliberate, Someone didn't bleed on these scrolls by accident. They marked them. Look at the pattern. She pointed to a series of thin lines across the parchment of the first scroll. These are parallel, intentional, like a signature or a warning. Rabbi Stein, who had remained nearby throughout the examination, leaned forward. "In our tradition," he said slowly, "marking a Torah scroll with blood would be unthinkable, unless it was meant to represent a covenant sealed in blood, or a desecration that had to be ritually acknowledged and preserved." The question hung in the air. Had these scrolls been blessed or cursed? David, the restoration worker who had first spotted the strongbox, stood by the eastern wall examining the roof timbers. He had spent the morning helping remove fallen beams, and now he was charting the wood's deterioration pattern on a makeshift diagram. Marcus joined him, grateful for a shift in focus. "Look at this," David said, pointing to marks carved into a beam. "These are tool marks, deliberate cuts. Someone carved into this wood intentionally, maybe 80, 90 years after the building was completed. See how the weathering is different? The wood inside the cut is lighter." Marcus leaned closer. The marks were faint but unmistakable. Thin parallel lines that formed something almost like letters, though not in any alphabet he recognized. "The scrolls weren't the only thing hidden," David said quietly. "Someone was trying to leave us a message." That evening, as the university team locked down the synagogue and secured the scrolls in climate-controlled storage, Marcus found himself walking through Prague's Jewish quarter. The November air was sharp and damp. Streetlights reflected off cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The hiding of the scrolls, the marks in the wood, the dried blood, they all pointed to a single moment in history when someone had made a desperate choice. Someone had believed these objects, these words, were worth preserving even at great cost. By morning, the real investigation would begin. The scrolls would be photographed and catalogued. The wood would be sent for dendrochronological analysis. David's mysterious marks would be studied by historians and linguists. But that night, walking through the ancient streets, Marcus understood that they were pursuing a mystery that refused to fit neatly into academic categories. This was about faith, survival, and the choices people make when they have nothing left to lose. Chapter 3. The Carver's Mark. The marks in the wood became an obsession. Elena's team managed to extract high-resolution scans of the timber beam, and within 48 hours they had invited Dr. František Svoboda from the Czech National Archives to examine the images. Svoboda was a paleographer, a reader of old writing systems, and his reputation in Prague's academic circles suggested he had seen nearly every form of mark, cipher, and intentional carving that medieval and early modern Europe had produced. He arrived on a grey Thursday morning, studied the scans for precisely 7 minutes, and then looked up with an expression that was difficult to read. "It's Hebrew," he said, "mixed with Old Czech. Whoever carved this was trying to communicate across languages, which suggests they were either multilingual themselves or carving instructions meant for 2 different audiences." Rabbi Stein was brought in to examine the carvings more closely. He traced the letters with a trembling finger, his lips moving silently as he translated. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It says, 'Testimony kept, 1654. Blood price paid. Let the finder understand. These words survived what flesh could not.'" The date positioned the carving exactly into the timeline of the blood-marked scrolls. 1654. The year coincided with a period of significant upheaval in Prague's Jewish community, a time of recurring expulsions, religious persecution, and forced conversions by Catholic authorities. It was also, Elena's research revealed, the year of a particularly violent raid on the Jewish quarter, where 3 synagogues had been burned and several community members killed. David stood near the strongbox, now displayed in a climate-controlled case in the synagogue's lower chamber. "Someone survived the raid," he said slowly, "and they hid the scrolls as a way to preserve them. The blood. Maybe it was their own. A blood oath to protect them." But Marcus had begun to suspect something more complicated. The dried blood pattern that Elena had documented didn't suggest a single person. The staining was too varied, too extensive. Multiple individuals had bled on these scrolls, or their blood had been deliberately applied over an extended period. The marking seemed ritualistic, almost ceremonial. That evening, as word of the discovery began to spread through Prague's media channels, the first sign of external interest appeared. A man in an expensive coat appeared at the synagogue's entrance, claiming to be a representative of a private antiquities collector in Vienna. The security guard turned him away, but Marcus noticed him lingering in the street, photographing the building from various angles. Elena's concerns echoed his own. If this becomes public knowledge that there are intact medieval Torah scrolls with a documented provenance to a specific historical moment, she said quietly, the value becomes astronomical, not just in monetary terms, but in terms of cultural patrimony. Everyone will want to claim them, study them, own them. Rabbi Stein seemed unconcerned with commercial interest, but he was deeply troubled by something else, a question that had been circulating through his conversations with other community historians. If the scrolls had been hidden in 1654, why had no record of them survived in any of the community's oral traditions? Why did the rabbinical archives contain no mention of scrolls sealed away, blood-marked and preserved? It was as if someone had deliberately ensured that the secret died with them, left only for those patient enough to demolish a roof to discover. If you're enjoying this adventure so far, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Chapter 4. The Rival. The man in the expensive coat returned on Friday morning, this time with credentials. His name was Heinrich Weiss, and he represented the Austro-Hungarian Heritage Foundation, a Vienna-based organization that had, over the past 2 decades, quietly acquired several significant Jewish cultural artifacts. His letter of introduction was impeccably formal and completely ambiguous about what, precisely, his organization intended to do with the synagogue's newly discovered scrolls. Marcus was the first to meet with him, a decision he immediately regretted. Weiss was charming in the way that wealthy men often are, attentive, well-informed, and utterly unmoved by ethical objections. He had already conducted preliminary research into the synagogue's ownership structure and was prepared to argue, with documentation, that certain preservation rights belonged to international cultural bodies rather than local Jewish authorities. The Prague Jewish community has tremendous symbolic claim, Weiss explained, seated in the synagogue's office with a coffee that had grown cold in his hand. But pragmatically, they lack the resources for proper conservation, authentication, and scholarly analysis. The Foundation can provide that. We've done it before, successfully. Elena was furious when she learned about the conversation. She pulled Marcus aside in the corridor outside the archive room and spoke with barely controlled intensity. His foundation has a history of acquiring artifacts and then having them disappear into private collections, she said. The Krakow Haggadah was nearly lost to them in 2009. They don't preserve, they hoard. But Weiss had planted a seed of genuine concern. The university team's equipment was adequate but aging. The climate control system for long-term scroll storage would require investment the municipality struggled to fund. The scholarly apparatus necessary to properly authenticate and analyze the texts was expensive and time-consuming. By Friday evening, the first cracks in the restoration team's unity had begun to appear. David was the one who voiced the concern that others were thinking. "Maybe he has a point," he said during a team meeting. "I mean, not his organization specifically, but the practical reality. We found something extraordinary. Do we have the capacity to actually care for it? Rabbi Stein's response was sharp and immediate. We have the responsibility to try. These scrolls were hidden by our people with their blood to ensure they survived. To hand them to foreign collectors would be a betrayal of that sacrifice. But even as he spoke, Marcus could see doubt crossing the rabbi's face. He knew something, some piece of information that had transformed this from a simple discovery into something far more complicated. The next morning, Marcus cornered him in the synagogue sanctuary. "What aren't you telling us?" Marcus asked directly. The rabbi was silent for a long time, kneeling before the small, eternal lamp that hung in the sanctuary's darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded aged in a way it hadn't before. "I recognized a mark in the wood carvings," he said, "a symbol that appears only in the private records of the community's most secretive institution, the Guardians. There were people, centuries ago, who held certain knowledge about these scrolls. Where they came from, why they were marked, what they were supposed to do. That knowledge was meant to be passed down within families, kept secret from outsiders, and sometimes even from the broader community." "And?" Marcus pressed. "And I am the last of my family line with access to those records, which means there are likely only a handful of people alive who know what these scrolls truly are and what they're meant to reveal." Chapter 5. The Archive. The information came in fragments. Rabbi Stein spent 3 days in the National Archives, with David and Elena accompanying him, pulling records and cross-referencing accounts written by Prague rabbis spanning 4 centuries. The picture that emerged was layered, almost Byzantine in its complexity. The scrolls themselves were genuine Torah copies, beautiful specimens of medieval Jewish scribal work, but they had been hidden for a specific reason. In 1648, during the 30 Years' War, a Jewish merchant from Prague had fled to the countryside ahead of Catholic military forces advancing through the region. He had hidden the scrolls in the synagogue's roof space, along with documents, now lost or deteriorated beyond recovery, that chronicled the fates of 87 members of the Prague Jewish community who had been murdered during a 1629 pogrom. The blood markings, it seemed, were signatures. Each person whose family member had died in that violence had contributed a drop of their own blood to the scrolls as a form of covenant. A promise that the memory of the dead would not be erased, that their names and stories would be preserved even if official records failed to survive. "It's a memorial," Elena said quietly, once the full picture had emerged. "The scrolls aren't just religious texts, they're a community record of grief and witness." But there was something else, something that the rabbi kept circling around without quite stating directly. Finally, over coffee in a cafe near the Old Town Square, he explained, "The people whose names are recorded in that blood covenant include not just Jews," he said. "Some of them were Christians. Some were people of mixed heritage. The violence in 1629 didn't discriminate as neatly as official histories have suggested, and there are certain families in Prague, Catholic families with significant social standing, whose ancestors appear in those records, names that have remained powerful in Prague for nearly 400 years. Marcus understood immediately, and if those families learned what their ancestors had done, what was recorded in the scrolls, they would have powerful motivation to ensure those scrolls never saw daylight, the rabbi finished. Which is why, I suspect, the discovery has attracted not just Heinrich Weiss and his foundation, but also individuals with purely local interests. That afternoon, the synagogue received a visit from a lawyer representing a coalition of Prague property owners. They had, the lawyer explained, a legal interest in the scrolls based on historical claims to the building's land. The matter would require lengthy litigation. In the meantime, the scrolls should perhaps be placed in neutral storage, say, With an institution like the Austro-Hungarian Heritage Foundation, which had experience managing contested artifacts, it was, Marcus realized, a coordinated effort. Multiple parties with different motivations but converging interests had recognized what the scrolls represented, not just religious texts, but historical evidence that could rewrite certain narratives about the city's past. The real pressure would come later that evening, when David failed to arrive for the scheduled security check on the storage chamber. Elena found him in the restoration workshop, helping Heinrich Weiss photograph the carved beam that bore the mystery marks. "He's offered me a position," David said, unable to meet their eyes. "Full funding for restoration work, international projects. Everything I've been wanting to do for the past 5 years, basically handed to me." Marcus felt the betrayal as a physical thing, but he understood the logic. Weiss was brilliant at identifying what people wanted most and offering it to them at exactly the moment they were most vulnerable, when the weight of competing moral obligations became too heavy to bear alone. The question was no longer whether the scrolls would survive. It was who would control their story. Chapter 6. The Hidden Passage. Elena discovered the passage by accident. While examining the structural damage from the roof collapse, she noticed that the masonry beneath the damaged beams was newer than the surrounding wall, not recent new, but 18th century new, which in a building constructed in the 1370s was noticeably younger. She called in a structural engineer, who confirmed what the material evidence suggested. The wall had been deliberately altered, the space beneath the roof sealed and reinforced, and then hidden beneath fresh plaster and paint. The passage ran the length of the eastern wing, barely 3 feet wide and so low that Marcus had to crouch as he moved through it. The air inside was cold and perfectly still, untouched by centuries of weather and human activity. The walls bore no marks, no writing, nothing except a single symbol carved into the stone at the passage's end, the same symbol that appeared in the wood carvings that Rabbi Stein had recognized from his family's secret archives. Within the passage, sealed behind a stone that fitted so precisely it had required a hammer and chisel to dislodge, they found a leather journal. The pages were brittle but legible, written in Yiddish in a careful, precise hand. Elena photographed each page before they dared to touch them further. Rabbi Stein began translating on sight, his voice growing quieter as he read. "It's a confession," he said finally, "written by a member of the Catholic clergy, a priest who participated in the 1629 violence. He's describing the event but also expressing remorse. He says he was threatened with excommunication if he didn't participate, that he watched people die, that the community leadership promised to conceal the worst of what happened." "Why hide this in the synagogue?" Marcus asked. "Because," Elena said slowly, "he was Catholic. Hiding something in a Jewish sacred space meant it was likely to be forgotten, never discovered by his own hierarchy. It was the only way to preserve his confession without risking his own fate, excommunication or execution if the church discovered he'd harbored doubt." David stood by the passage entrance, his face pale. When he spoke, his words came out carefully, as if each one required significant effort. "Weiss asked me to report anything unusual in the restoration work, to flag historical findings before they became public. He said it was standard practice for artifact authentication." No one responded immediately. The weight of the confession, a Catholic priest's 400-year-old remorse hidden in Jewish sacred space, seemed to demand silence. Elena was the one who broke it. She pulled out her phone and began photographing the leather journal, the stone seal, the passage itself. "This stays documented," she said, "every step. Photographs, measurements, chemical analysis of the materials, time-stamp records. If Weiss or anyone else tries to suppress this, the evidence is already distributed across cloud servers and university systems. The strategy was sound but precarious. They were racing against time now. Weiss knew something was happening. David's shifting allegiance made that clear, and if word reached him that a significant new discovery had been made, the pressure to hand over the scrolls would become irresistible. By the next morning, Elena had prepared a formal academic announcement of the findings, the journal, the passage, the structural evidence. All of it would be submitted simultaneously to the Czech National Archives, the International Society for Jewish Studies, and the media. It was, she explained, the only way to ensure the discovery became public knowledge before powerful interests could suppress it. If this treasure hunt already has you hooked, hit the like button. It helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Chapter 7. The Counter-Pressure. The announcement went live on Thursday morning. By Friday, Prague's media had seized the story with the intensity of hounds sensing blood. The narrative was irresistible. Hidden Jewish artifacts, medieval cover-ups, Catholic confession of complicity in historical violence, and competing interests trying to control the narrative. The story spread across international media within hours. The BBC ran a segment. The New York Times contacted Elena for an interview. University departments that had shown minimal interest in the project suddenly requested formal consultations. But pressure came from unexpected quarters as well. A spokesperson for the Vienna-based foundation issued a statement accusing Elena and her team of opportunistic publicity seeking that compromised scholarly integrity. Heinrich Weiss disappeared, his hotel room checked out, his Vienna office revealing nothing except a secretary who claimed he was traveling and unreachable. More troublingly, representatives from 3 separate Prague families appeared at the university, each with lawyers and claims to the scrolls based on property rights, cultural patrimony, and historical grievances. One family alleged that their ancestor had been unfairly blamed for violence in 1629 and that the scrolls, if they contained evidence exonerating their family, were essentially stolen property. Another family claimed the entire discovery was fabricated to defame their historical reputation. Rabbi Stein, now moving slowly and appearing considerably more aged than he had at the investigation's start, organized a community meeting. Over 100 people attended, descendants of the 1629 victims, other Prague rabbis, scholars, and community members who felt invested in ensuring the scrolls remained in Jewish hands. "The blood on these scrolls represents witness," he said, his voice carrying through the synagogue with unexpected strength. "Not just Jewish witness, but collective human witness to what occurred. That blood was shed not in anger, but in covenant, a promise that memory would survive. If we allow these scrolls to be locked away in private collections or contested through legal battles about historical blame and exoneration, we betray that covenant." The meeting produced a resolution. The scrolls would remain in Prague, held in trust by a community foundation specifically created to manage them. They would be made available for scholarly study. A translation and authentication process would begin immediately, but ownership and control would remain with the Prague Jewish community. It was a remarkable moment of collective will, but it was also, Marcus knew, temporary. Legal battles would follow. Political pressure would intensify. The families involved had significant resources and historical grievances that wouldn't fade quietly. What nobody anticipated was David's appearance at the community meeting, 2 hours after Rabbi Stein's speech concluded. He stood before the assembled group, visibly nervous, and delivered a statement that silenced the room. "I was asked by Heinrich Weiss to help facilitate the scroll's transfer to the foundation," David said quietly. "I agreed because I convinced myself that international scholarship was more important than local politics. But I was wrong. I spent 3 days in that hidden passage, photographing the carved stone, the leather journal, the blood marks on the scrolls, and I realized something. This isn't an abstract historical question. It's about actual people's actual sacrifice. I can't be complicit in erasing that. He then produced a data drive containing every photograph, measurement, and communication he'd had with Weiss. Evidence that would, eventually, lead to investigations into the Foundation's acquisition practices and result in several of their previous acquisitions being returned to their communities of origin. Elena hugged him afterward. Though her expression was complicated, redemption through confession, she seemed to be thinking, was never quite as clean as it appeared in narratives. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The conservation process took 4 months. Eleanor's team worked methodically, documenting every aspect of the scroll's condition, the blood-staining patterns, the composition of the materials used in their creation. The leather journal was restored by an expert in medieval materials, and its full translation completed by a committee of Yiddish scholars and historians. What emerged was a portrait of 1629 that was significantly more complex than the sanitized historical records had suggested. The violence hadn't been a simple pogrom. It was the result of a complex of tensions, misunderstandings, economic competition, and the deliberate manipulation of religious fervor by authorities who benefited from communal conflict. Certain perpetrators had acted out of genuine religious conviction. Others had been coerced. A few, like the priest whose confession remained in the leather journal, had participated reluctantly and spent the rest of their lives harboring guilt. More remarkably, the scroll's blood signatures revealed that many of the victims' families had included non-Jewish members, mixed families, religiously diverse households, people whose identities didn't fit neatly into the categorical thinking of their era. Their blood was mixed with that of Jewish victims, creating what Elena described as a record of the fact that human community transcends religious boundary. Rabbi Stein held the first scroll as it was returned to the newly constructed display case, climate-controlled, architecturally sympathetic to the synagogue's medieval aesthetic. His hands trembled as he positioned it, and tears ran freely down his weathered face. "My family kept this secret for nearly 400 years, he said to Marcus and Elena, who stood nearby, "not because we wanted to hide truth, but because we believed, perhaps wrongly, that some truths were too heavy for one generation to carry. We thought we were protecting people, but we were also erasing them." The international academic response to the findings was substantial. Scholars from 10 countries published analyses and interpretations. The scrolls became a focus of study in medieval history, Jewish studies, religious violence, and community formation. Universities requested facsimiles. Museums inquired about exhibition possibilities. But the most meaningful response came from the families whose ancestors had bled on the scrolls, descendants of the 1629 victims, and surprising numbers of descendants from the families who had been initially blamed for the violence participated in a memorial ceremony held in the restored synagogue. They read names. They lit candles. They acknowledged the complexity of their collective past. One of the Catholic families whose ancestor had participated in the violence, a professional historian herself, published a detailed study of her family's complicated legacy. The work became a model for how communities could acknowledge historical trauma without either erasing complexity or excusing violence. Marcus, standing in the scaffolding that would eventually restore the synagogue's roof to its original form, found himself contemplating what it meant for objects to carry memory. The scrolls had survived collapse, hidden within sealed space, marked with blood and covenant. They had emerged in an age that was, finally, perhaps ready to read what they had been inscribed to say. The carving in the wood, Testimony kept, 1654, blood price paid. Let the finder understand. These words survived what flesh could not. Had proven prophetic. The words on the scrolls and in the leather journal had indeed survived. And the finding had forced a community to confront truths about itself that it had spent generations avoiding. Chapter 9. The Price of Memory. The roof restoration was completed in May of the following year. The wooden beams had been carefully preserved, treated, and reinforced. The carved symbols were left deliberately untouched, a record of the medieval craftspeople who had created them and the desperate soul who had carved that final covenant into the wood. Standing beneath the newly restored roof, Elena reflected on what archaeology always revealed. The past doesn't remain buried. Given enough time, given enough pressure, given enough consequence to forgetting, the hidden always emerges. The question was only how a community would respond when confronted with truths it had perhaps preferred to leave undiscovered. The leather journal had been digitized and made available through the National Archives. The scrolls themselves remained in Prague, displayed in a dedicated chamber that had been constructed specifically to preserve them while allowing scholarly access. A foundation, not the Austro-Hungarian one, but a community-based organization, managed their study and interpretation. David had gone to work for Elena's conservation team, completing the educational credentials he'd abandoned years earlier. His expertise in restoration work, combined with his hard-earned understanding of the ethical complexities surrounding artifact ownership and historical narrative control, made him invaluable. Heinrich Weiss's foundation had collapsed following investigations into their acquisition practices. Several artifacts were returned to their communities of origin. Weiss himself had disappeared into European obscurity, though rumors suggested he was operating under an assumed name in Southeast Asia, still acquiring historical objects through networks that preferred not to ask difficult questions about ownership. Rabbi Stein died peacefully on a quiet winter morning, 6 months after the roof's restoration. At his funeral, Elena read a passage from the leather journal, the priest's confession of his own complicity in violence, his decades-long struggle with remorse, his final act of preserving Jewish testimony within Jewish sacred space. "These scrolls," Elena said, her voice carrying through the synagogue that had seemed, for a brief period, to contain all of Prague's most complicated questions, remind us that memory isn't the property of the dead. It belongs to anyone willing to carry it forward, to examine it honestly, and to allow it to change how we understand ourselves. The final discovery came 12 months after the roof collapse, when conservation work on the carved beam revealed, beneath centuries of accumulated dust and varnish, additional marks in the wood. These carved letters formed a date, 1785, and below that a single word in Old Czech that translated approximately to remembered. Someone, a century after the original carving, had deliberately added their own testimony to the wood. Someone else had recognized the significance of what was recorded there and had felt compelled to add their own small statement of witnessing. Marcus understood then what the rabbi had seemed to know from the beginning. Some traditions of remembering are meant to expand across generations. The hidden passage, the sealed scrolls, the carved messages, they weren't meant to be discovered once and then resolved. They were meant to be rediscovered by each new generation, to be reinterpreted through new understanding, to call forth new witnesses willing to carry the weight of testimony forward. The synagogue no longer felt like a building containing history. It had become a space where history remained alive, demanding response, requiring each person who entered to decide what they would do with the truth that walls and wood and dried blood had preserved. The restoration work continued. Some wounds take centuries to heal, and some healing requires that we continually revisit what broke us. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of discovery and hidden history. See you in the next adventure.